Hello. So now we're going to look at chapter 7, which is sentences, if I'm not mistaken. No, introduction, yes, Beyond the Sentence, right? By Leslie Jeffries from Discovering Language. Now, before we start, I would like to go back to a couple of things from the previous chapter. I wanted to clarify a couple of things about connotation. Here you get a synonym, which is implication, right? And actually, further ahead, there's a nice box that shows the difference between connotation and denotation. Well, here, for example, the difference between home and house, right? Home being a place that connotes warmth and security and childhood and things like that, right? Maybe that's a reason, well, not maybe actually, the reason why we say, for example, little sister rather than smaller sister, right? Or small sister, because small only suggests size, whereas little suggests or connotes maybe friendliness or love or maybe warmth as well. Well, anyway, I assume this is a concept that's very clear to you. I wanted also to go back to this question of hostile. You had some homonyms in Unit 6, right? Actually, when talking about, these were homophones actually, within homonymy. When talking about hostel and hostel, both being homophones as a place to stay, hostel as a synonym for hotel, or sort of hotel rather, and hostile for someone who is aggressive, right? Now, hostile is the American pronunciation, right? And you can see here, and I told you that there were many other words that share this change in pronunciation between American and English, and I wanted to show you actually many. Sorry. Missile, missile. Senile, remember the first one is British in blue, in red American. Senile and senile, the same. It's very difficult to say senile, right? But fertile and fertile. Reptile and reptile is one option, reptile too in American English. Futile and futile. Docile and docile. Puerile and puerile. Sorry, and for that we have the Spanish, pueril, right? Relativo a los niños. Tactile remains the same. I hope you're noticing that this needs initial stress, right, for this change to take place. Gentile, it remains the same, and I want to take you to the definition in Spanish. Maybe you think it is a false friend, pero gentil, en primer lugar, es una persona, entre los judíos, dicho de una persona o de una comunidad que profesa otra religión. Bueno, acá estaba gentil como una persona de otra religión también, right? Y también gentil, obviamente, como amable y cortés en español. Reptile, you can go reptile and reptile. Tactile or tactile. Profile and profile. This one doesn't change. Imbecile, imbecile. False friend, right? Maybe too strong in Spanish, a bit stronger than in English. Not a full false friend. And volatile, volatile. Okay, I apologize. Hats off to my language teacher, who was also a phonology teacher and liked to teach us some things about pronunciation. My teacher was Ronchetti, right? Maria Silvia Ronchetti. All right, now I wanted to show you this because actually it's something that is useful. Of course, you may discuss it with your phonology teacher, right? And now we're going to go to the next concept, which is the next concept that appears in your notes, right? Well, wait, before we go to cohesion, this sentence says that it is about sentences, right? Not words. And I wanted to share with you some words by another linguist called Ray Jackendoff, in his book User's Guide to Thought and Meaning, he says something funny, which is, words and sentences are strange kinds of entities. And if you think about it, a word is just a label, right? And there's so much behind it. Think of a word as a photograph of yourself. I mean, it doesn't really say a lot about you, does it? Though it does say something, it doesn't say a lot, and it doesn't say all, naturally. And then as regards sentences, Ray Jackendoff says, remember that rational thinking relies not just on understanding sentences, but also on forming intuitive connections among sentences. And this is something we rarely think about, but we are constantly making connections between sentences. And this is what this text is about. This chapter is about thinking beyond the words and thinking about a text. And that's what we're going to talk about cohesion, please. Cohesion and coherence, right? These two concepts, which are very complex, actually, well, not very complex, sometimes they're confused. Here, once again, you have a nice box to tell the difference between cohesion and coherence, right? And we'll get started with coherence, which is when something hangs together, right? When something makes sense. Whereas cohesion has to do with showing a text as a unit. Michael Hoey, a very popular linguist, says that cohesion is an objective quality of a text, and that coherence is a subjective quality of a text. And that is very important, right? Because actually coherence is not something that we can see, that we can find, right? That's why the distinction between subjective and objective. And now I am going to read from a book, A Glossary of Semantics and Pragmatics, that says, as regards cohesion and coherence, these are types of connectedness which distinguish texts from random collections of words. So something that doesn't make any sense from something that is a unit. Cohesion is a matter of form and concerns mainly grammatical ways of connecting one piece of language to another, such as agreement and anaphora, right? She goes, you would say. Coherence is a matter of meaning compatibility and relevance. And this is very important, right? The idea of compatibility. So the writers give us an example, and the example is, 1. My father came into my room, so I plugged him and I switched him on. This is an example of a text that is cohesive, because when I say I plugged him, it refers to my father, right? But clearly it is not coherent. And text number 2, which is, there was a loud knock, I opened the door, to policemen. Well, this text is actually cohesive. Sorry, not cohesive, because there are no markers, right, of cohesion, but it is coherent. Now, why is it coherent? Because and for this, we need to go back maybe to the concept of schema, yes, of this organized knowledge that is in your brain that helps you understand that it is possible for policemen to knock on your door and stand there and be ready to tell you something, right? And possibly you think that this is not going to be good, right? It is part of the world we have constructed, so we can make sense out of it. Notice that I have another example. The doctor whose wife is missing is in his house. Police are digging in the garden. Now, once again, this text is coherent, right? It makes sense that there is a doctor, that he has a wife, that he lives in a house, and that he has been accused of being responsible for the disappearance of his wife, right? And we understand further that they're looking for the body in the garden. Now, please note that this idea of coherence, of making sense, of hanging together, has got to do with this schema, right? The knowledge of the world that we have in our heads. But the process of drawing conclusions is what we call inference, which is going to be chapter 8, right? Which we're going to discuss, in chapter 8. This example of the doctor whose wife is missing is taken from the book called Words and Phrases by Michael Stubbs. All right. What I wanted to say about coherence is that we need to be very careful, right? Because it is a very deceptive concept. We can be misled by cues because sometimes we make sense of things that do not make sense, right? Particularly when we pay attention to another language, a language that is foreign. But the exact same thing may happen within our language. And this gives rise to many problems in translation. In the video about analogy, right? Remember there's a video on analogy. You have to watch that one. Here it is. I explain the poor translation for the expression for all, right? And in that case, what happens when people mistranslate for all is not just that they made a mistake about for all not meaning para todos, perdón, creyendo que significa para todo cuando significa a pesar de. What happens is that people force an interpretation of a text, right? Because it suits a preconceived idea that we have of its meaning. The same happens with another expression, which is to be sure, right? To be sure can be used, though seldom, to mean para estar seguro. But most of the cases, it means indeed, right? So it is just an emphatic way of stating something, right? And it doesn't have a literal meaning, que es para estar seguro. But the problem is that we force coherence. We force the text to make sense that actually doesn't. So we need to be very, very, very careful with coherence, right? All right, the next point is cohesion, right? Now, cohesion is rather simpler. It is linguistic. It has to do with referring items. That is to say, one item that connects with another one. Linguists say that cohesion must be satisfied. That is, when I say he came in, I need to know who he is, right? I need to have had some information before that. And that's the reason why there is dependence between the two members. That's why cohesion is relational and directional, because it makes me go somewhere. All of this means that cohesion is something that binds a text, right? That creates just a loose connection of sentences into a semantic unit, right? So it's very much like an egg, right? Now, if you think about cohesion thinking of its elements, you will see that cohesion is rather like a rag bag, right? You have lots of elements there that I assume you know. We're going to review them. The first one, according to Leslie Jeffries, is repetition, but actually repetition should be included within lexical cohesion, right? So we'll go there, but actually it's just when you repeat a word, right? And when you repeat a word, you know that the same word was elsewhere, and clearly you see how you will go back, your mind will go back to the other word, and you will know you're talking about the same thing. Now that's why we usually use synonyms, and that's why we can get into trouble sometimes, because the synonym we find may not be the perfect one. There's another concept related to the idea of repetition and synonymy, which is elegant variation, right? When you find another way of saying the same thing, just not to repeat yourself. That's something different, right? And we will see that in text and, well, working, right? In a real text. Now, the elements of cohesion are, and I'm following Jeffries, are reference, right? Remember that reference includes pronouns like nominative or subjective. pronouns, also demonstrative pronouns, but when they are unattached, that is to say, when they are pronouns, right? Not this house, but this helps me understand, right? When this is unattached, we call this and that, those and these, unattached demonstratives, because I'm going to write it down here. Right? Because they can lead to confusion. You may not know what follows, right? So they're very tricky. I mean, what exactly they're referring to. So usually they're considered, when we use them, we think of them as being having poor style. We'll include here under this list of reference the definite article. So if you suddenly in a text it says, I don't know, the dog came in, well, which dog, right? You never told me there was a dog, so I need a dog first. And then once you have that, you see how we can satisfy this relational concept of cohesion, right? Okay, a dog, the dog, that makes sense. And also words like such, right? The next category is substitution, and the elements of substitution are, I don't think she mentions them all here, so I will. They are one, as in I want the blue one, do, as in I do, do you want something, I do, so and not, as in I think so, or I would rather not, and same, as I'll have the same, right? Once again, these elements make you go back to retrieve the word or the concept they relate to. The next category is ellipsis, right? Ellipsis is very interesting because it involves, actually to me, it's kind of like a magical category, right? Because think about how clever you need to be able to retrieve, well, it's not a question of being clever, but how knowledgeable about language you need to be able to retrieve the elements that have disappeared, right? Oh, I realize now that I forgot my great example about reference, right? So I'm going to read that great example to you, and I will go back to ellipsis in a minute, because we think about reference as not being problematic. But what about this example? This is taken from The Magicians, a novel. Quentin knew James and Julia better than he knew anyone else in the world, not excluding his parents, and they knew him. So the question is, who is they? The parents or James and Julia? Quentin knew James and Julia better than he knew anyone else in the world, not excluding his parents, and they knew him. Now, because you know the way texts are constructed, you feel that not excluding his parents, I say feel because you're not reading it, is sort of parenthetical. It is enclosed, it is set off by commas. So they must refer to James and Julia rather than to the parents, because that was parenthetical, right? That was a kind of interpolation. But actually, it could refer to the parents, grammatically speaking, right? It's the next plural noun, right? The closest plural noun, because of the concept of what the sentence is saying. You also adjust, and you will also say, yes, it must mean that they knew him, that it must be James and Julia, because actually he's talking about James and Julia, not about his parents. But I like this example as a very good example of something that. I mean, to show that reference is not so straightforward, right? Now, we go back to substitution, and on many occasions, people say that substitution is the same as reference, and that is true, right? When you use a pronoun, you are substituting maybe a proper noun or another noun, so that's true. And then we go back to ellipsis. As I said, I think this is a magical category because of our capacity to retrieve what has been omitted, right? There are three types of ellipsis. Jeffries doesn't tell us that. This is, I forgot to tell you at the very beginning of this discussion, that this is in another set of notes that students of mine know from Language 2, and it is on Dropbox. It's a Word file that is called Cohesion and It, right? If I don't forget, at the end, I will go back to the concept of it, right? At the very end of cohesion. Now, in those notes, we learned that there are three types of substitution. As I said, nominal, so when you say, ellipsis, three types of ellipsis. Nominal, when I say, I'm reading the example from your notes, not Jeffrey's, but my notes in the Word file. Nelly liked the green tiles. Myself, I preferred the blue tiles, so that's nominal. Verbal is when you omit the verb or part of the verb phrase, as in, should anyone have been told? John should, or John should have, or John should have been, all right? And there's also clausal ellipsis, as in, he said he would take early retirement as soon as he could, and he has. What we omit is take early retirement. Now, ellipsis seems to be quite straightforward, right? But actually it is not, right? It can lead to confusion, it can lead to ambiguity, as in the sentence, which is taken from Fowler under the heading of ambiguity, right? The sentence goes, he loves his dog more than his children. This could be, he loves his dog more than his children, so the love he professes for his dog is greater than the one he professes for his children. Or I could interpret this as, he loves his dog more than his children love the dog, right? There's room for ambiguity when there is ellipsis, and actually, you need to make some adjustments when you recover the information in a text, right? So, for example, in the sentence, also taken from Fowler, you thought I was a virgin when I married you. No, I didn't. And in that case, you need to retrieve, actually, no, I didn't think. And you need to adjust from you thought to I think. But more complex is the following example. His knowledge is unquestioned. His opinions are. So in that case, what I am retrieving is not the full word unquestioned, but just the word questioned. I repeat the sentence. His knowledge is unquestioned. His opinions are. So his opinions are questioned, not unquestioned. But notice that all of this is something you can do in your heads, right? Because you understand the concept of coherence, that is to say, something that makes sense, all right? The next category is conjunction. And for this, I need to tell you that also on Dropbox, there are two files simply with lists of conjunctions. One is called Cohesive Devices, and it's taken from Nuttall's book, Teaching Reading Skills in a Foreign Language. And the other one is called Discourse Markers, and they're taken from a book for learners of English that is called Proficiency Gold, right? Now, conjunction is a very simple concept, and it is cohesive simply because if I say but, I need to have two ideas that contrast each other, right? And if I say and, I need the concept that follows and to be an addition to the concept that preceded and, right? Otherwise, I will not be able to work it out. So see that for every element within cohesion, we see referring items, a relationship, a dependence, a direction, and a relationship that must be satisfied, right? Okay, the most interesting of all is lexical cohesion. Of course, you have repetition, which was at the beginning of these notes on Leslie Jeffries. And lexical cohesion is the same as what we saw in chapter 6, sense relations, right? So there are 4 types of sense relations. These are synonymy and antonymy. And also on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the relationship between superordinate and co-hyponym and holonyms and co-meronyms, right? This is something you saw earlier, so we're not going to go back there. But why is this important? For two reasons. One, a text sets up its own sense relations. What we know as a synonym outside the text will not function as a synonym inside the text. I gave you the example in the previous chapter of baffle and perplex. We may think they're synonyms, but in the sentence, this is baffling or at least perplexing. Perplexing is something less than baffling, right? Clearly. So that is why this is so important. The second reason this is important is because we learn the way in which English carves the world. That is to say, languages think about reality in different ways, right? You must have all heard the story of people who live in cold countries who have many names or many ways to describe snow. This is not absolutely true, but anyway. Let's think of another example that's very popular in translation, and that is the one of a nut, right? For this, I'm going to show you the photo of a nut. See? Well, I'm not going to show you. I'm going to tell you. It's easier, faster. The word nut, yes, is the superordinate. And you know there are many types of nuts. There are peanuts and cashew nuts and walnuts and whatnot. But actually, we use the word nut also in English as a synonym for a walnut, right? So a nut will be frequently a walnut, though not necessarily. The problem is that the word nut may refer in English to the superordinate, entonces en castellano nut sería fruta seca, or it may refer to a walnut or a peanut. That will depend on the context, so we might need to say nuez o lo que fuere en ese caso, ¿sí? And that's why it is important for us to see that these sense relationships are also another way of understanding how English, in our case, how English functions, okay? All right, I see now that I forgot a concept that I think is useful. When you're talking about ellipses, we may say that something is ellipse or ellipted or omitted. But we also use the term elliptical to refer to a text in which many ideas, maybe sometimes just the words, but also many concepts have been omitted, right? And in that sense, the text makes too many demands on the reader or the listener because, well, the listener needs to fill in all the blanks, basically, right? Okay, what follows is not of interest to me from this chapter. I told you about that. Briefly, Jeffries discusses metafunctions on page 191. This is something you're going to see in other classes. There are three functions. This comes from, metafunctions. This comes from functional linguistics, Halliday being its proponent. Interpersonal, ideational, and textual. These are, say, three different levels of looking at a text. So you can analyze the interpersonal part, which would be its evaluative or attitudinal part. Ideational, that is to say the concept, so this would be the denotative part of a text, what it discusses. And the textual, which is the strategies a text uses to communicate. This may refer to the way information is distributed or to maybe the connectors that are used. So it's another way of approaching a text, right? When we think about metafunctions. I do not use these concepts frequently, to be frank. What follows, and practically the rest of the chapter, is something that you're going to see in other classes. It refers more to maybe philosophical aspects of language and linguistics. But I want to draw your attention to page 195 when we talk about paradigmatic and syntagmatic relationships. Paradigmatic relationships are vertical relationships. So these are the relationships which tell us what different elements may fit in the same slot of a structure. So the example Jeffries gives here is who's going to eat the last, and it could be, I don't know, the last crumpet, the last piece of cake, the last sweet, right? But I could also think of who's going to, and replace, instead of who's going to eat, who's going to listen, who's going to, I don't know, do the homework, right? So it means to, it refers to the choices we can make in the vertical axis, whereas the syntagmatic axis is the horizontal axis, right? Which is the one that decides how we combine words. So, for example, in order to express concession, I may use although or despite, but both of them have different, make different choices regarding what follows, right? Despite may be followed by a noun, despite the weather, whereas although needs a clause, right? Although she was feeling cold, right? All right, let me check. This is the last one, so we have covered everything in all the categories, right? Remember, you can do this go back thing that I like so much. Meanwhile, I'll check that I have not left anything. Yes, I think I have told you everything I wanted to share from this chapter, and I hope this is clear. Let me know if you have any pending questions, right? So, bye, that is all.